My son was born too early, at just 28 weeks. He fought hard for 11 days in the sterile, humming maze of the NICU, and I was at war with myself the entire time, torn between hope and a paralyzing dread. But when he finally slipped away, his tiny lungs too fragile for this world, I felt something darkly resembling relief. Relief that he would never have to face the father who could never truly be one. Relief that his short life spared him from a man whose soul was already stained beyond repair. It started unraveling when I was just 6 weeks pregnant. That's when I found out who my fiancé really was, the man I thought I'd spend my life with. He wasn't just running from his past, he was hiding from it. He had fled to my city to bury his secrets, and he buried them well, until they crawled to the surface, ugly and uncontainable. Drunk and guilt-ridden one night, he confessed. He spoke with a raw, feverish honesty, piecing together a crime that still haunts me. He showed me news articles, the mugshot of his friend who was rotting in jail for his crime, and the twisted brotherhood they maintained, as if they were both playing a sick game of patience, waiting out a prison sentence that only one of them served. I even watched him bury the murder weapon on his aunt's farm, shoveling dirt over any chance of redemption. After that night, his confessions gave way to violence. I became a prisoner in my own pregnancy. My days were filled with threats and terror. I was chased, grabbed, shaken, shoved, hit. I cried constantly, suffocated by fear and shame. Every bruise on my skin felt like a bruise on my soul. I apologized silently to my unborn son, over and over, begging him to forgive me for choosing so poorly, for bringing him into a world overshadowed by his father's darkness. I begged him to forgive me for the man who screamed death wishes at him the day before the doctors told me that my baby's life hung by a thread. Nurses had to drag him out of my hospital room, his fury poisoning the air where our child should have found safety. And when my water broke too early, a rush of time and chances lost, I knew who was to blame. It wasn't fate or bad luck. It was him. My son was collateral damage to a man who knew only how to destroy. He took 2 sons from 2 mothers, a reckless, selfish thief of life and hope. And I hate him for it. I mourn the child I lost, but I shudder to think of the kind of father he would have had, the kind of man who could look at his own son and wish him gone. A father whose hands had blood on them long before they ever touched mine. A father who would have been a constant shadow, a danger I could never fully shield my child from. Maybe it's cruel to think it, but I believe my son's passing was the merciful thing, sparing him a life tethered to a man capable of such violence and deceit. I could never look at his little face, his tiny hands, and imagine him caught in that web of anger and crime. I wish my son could hear me now. I wish I could tell him how desperately sorry I am. Sorry that I couldn't give him the life he deserved. Sorry that his short existence was tangled in my worst mistake. But mostly, I'm sorry that I ever let that man near us. I still see my son sometimes in my dreams, fragile and perfect, untouched by the pain that stained his short days in the NICU. I imagine a different world, one where his father wasn't a monster, where we were just another family with hopes and fears, not buried secrets and unspoken threats. But those dreams always shatter in the morning light, reality creeping back in like a shadow. It's impossible to forget the ugliness that surrounded us, that poisoned what little time we had. My son never got to take a breath outside the sterile walls of that hospital, never got to feel sunlight on his skin or hear my voice without the constant beep of monitors in the background. And yet, I can't help but feel that he was spared from a fate much worse. I remember every harsh word, every shove that sent me stumbling, clutching my swollen belly as if I could somehow protect him from the man responsible for all our suffering. I remember lying in that hospital bed, tubes and wires everywhere, feeling trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The doctors would come in with their sad eyes and clipped tones, talking about complications and risks, but all I could think about was the rage simmering just outside my door. Every day felt like a battle, not just against the grim medical realities, but against the volatile man I was tethered to. I was terrified of him, of losing my baby, of the life I could see stretching before me like a road paved with nothing but fear and regret. There was a moment, just a day before the doctors told me my baby might not make it, when his father leaned in close, eyes cold and voice dripping with venom, and told me he hoped our son would die. His words cut deeper than any blow, twisting into me like a blade. I remember looking at him and feeling nothing but disgust. How could I have ever let this man into my life? Into my child's life? I wanted to scream, to claw my way out of the reality I was trapped in, but all I could do was cry silently, my heart breaking not just for the son I was about to lose, but for the life that had brought me to this moment. When the nurses kicked him out that last time, it was as if the air in the room shifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe without the weight of his presence suffocating me. But it was too late. My son was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do but hold his tiny hand and whisper promises I knew I could never keep. I told him I would protect him, that he was loved, that he would never have to feel the ugliness of this world. But even then, I knew those words were empty. I couldn't protect him. I couldn't even protect myself. When he finally passed, a quiet, fragile ending to a life that never really began, all I felt was numb. I couldn't even cry. I sat there, staring at his still form, and felt a horrible, guilty relief. Relief that his father would never have the chance to poison his life the way he had poisoned mine. Relief that I wouldn't be forever bound to a man who wore his crimes like a second skin. I hate that I feel this way, but I also know it's the truth. My son deserves so much better than what I could have given him with that man in our lives. The hardest part is living with the what-ifs, the endless possibilities of what might have been. I try to picture a world where my son got to grow up, where I could have raised him far away from the shadow of his father. I imagine birthday parties, scraped knees, first words, and tiny hands reaching for mine. But those are just fantasies, sweet illusions that dissolve as quickly as they come. Every day I wake up and carry the weight of my choices, the unrelenting guilt that gnaws at me, whispering that I failed him. I failed to see the monster beside me until it was too late. I failed to protect my son from the chaos and violence that ultimately stole him from me. And I failed to be strong enough to leave when I still had the chance. If I could speak to my son now, I'd tell him how fiercely I loved him, even in the midst of all the fear and confusion. I'd tell him that his short life meant more to me than anything, that he was my light in the darkest time of my life. And I'd beg him to forgive me, for my mistakes, my blindness, my weakness. I'd beg him to understand that sometimes love isn't enough to save the people we care about, that sometimes the world is just too cruel, too heavy for such tiny shoulders. I am left with nothing but memories, too few and too painful. But in my heart, my son is free. Free from the shadows of his father, free from the violence that shaped his brief existence. I have to believe that he's in a better place, untouched by the horrors that haunt me still. It's the only way I can keep going, the only solace I have left in this broken world. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when the world feels far away, I imagine what it would have been like to raise my son alone. I imagine a small apartment filled with the sounds of laughter and lullabies, toys scattered across the floor, and sunlight streaming in through the windows. I see him growing up with my smile, with bright eyes that would never know the fear that shadowed my pregnancy. In those daydreams, he is safe, happy, and unburdened by the sins of his father. I cling to these visions as if they can rewrite the past, as if they can make the pain hurt a little less. But reality always claws its way back in, sharp and relentless. My grief is a beast that never sleeps. It wakes with me every morning, gnawing at my resolve. It whispers that I will never escape the shadow of that man, that no matter how far I run, I will always carry the stain of what he did, of what I allowed to happen. I remember every threat, every blow, every night spent curled up and crying, apologizing to the life inside me that I couldn't protect. I remember the nurses who tried to comfort me, their faces etched with pity and anger, as they watched the man who should have been my support turn into my greatest tormentor. They saw what I was too afraid to fully acknowledge, the violence that had wormed its way into my life, eroding everything good. And yet, there were moments when I almost let myself believe that things could change. The times when he would break down, crying, begging for forgiveness, promising that he would be better. But those were just lies wrapped in empty gestures, fleeting as smoke. He would always return to the same vicious cycle, a man with hands too used to hurting. I see now that he was never sorry, not for what he did to me, not for the lives he destroyed, and certainly not for the son he would never get to know. The cruelty ran too deep, a part of him as much as his heartbeat. After my son died, people told me to move on, to let go, to find peace. They don't understand that there is no peace in this, only a fragile balancing act between surviving and succumbing to the weight of it all. I've been to support groups where mothers speak of loss, but I can't bring myself to share. My story feels tainted, tangled in layers of trauma that others can't quite grasp. They lost their children to illness or accidents, cruel twists of fate that they could do nothing to prevent. But I lost mine to something much darker, something that feels like a reflection of my own failures. I listen to them talk about their children with such pure, untainted love, and I can't help but feel that my grief is something altogether different. It's stained with anger, regret, and a bitterness that I can't seem to scrub away. I moved away from that city, far from the places that hold too many memories, too much pain. I cut off all ties with him, blocking every number, every account, every connection that could bring him back into my life. But even now, his shadow lingers. I hear about him through whispers, stories passed along like poisonous secrets. He's still out there, living his life, untouched by the consequences of what he did. He's still friends with the man serving time for his crime, still wrapped up in a web of deceit that I can't unravel. It eats at me, the injustice of it all. He walks free, while my son lies in a grave too small, his life cut short by a man who never deserved to be called a father. I've tried to forgive myself, but forgiveness feels impossible when the wounds are still so raw. I go to therapy, trying to piece myself back together, but the therapist's office is just another place where I replay every painful memory. They tell me it's not my fault, that I did the best I could in an impossible situation, but their words feel hollow. How can I believe them when I carry this guilt every single day? How can I absolve myself when my son's absence is a constant reminder of my own shortcomings? There are days when the anger flares up, white-hot and blinding. Anger at him, at myself, at a universe that could allow such senseless loss. I want to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But there are other days when I feel nothing at all, just a numbness that spreads through me, dulling the edges of my grief but never truly healing it. I visit my son's grave sometimes, bringing flowers and whispered apologies. I tell him stories of the life I wish he could have had, of the mother I wish I could have been. I tell him that I loved him more than I ever thought possible, even in the darkest moments. I know I will never truly be free of this. It's a weight I'll carry with me always, a scar that will never fully heal. But I owe it to my son to keep going, to find some semblance of peace in a world that has been so unkind. I owe it to him to remember that even in the brief time he was here, he was loved fiercely, desperately, and completely. I owe it to myself to rebuild, no matter how broken the pieces feel. I hope that somewhere, somehow, my son knows that he was the best part of me. And I hope that in whatever place he rests, he is safe, untouched by the pain that defines me. For now, all I can do is keep moving forward, one day at a time, carrying his memory like a fragile, precious thing, something beautiful that was born in the midst of so much darkness.